This is Outlander Science Club, brought to you by Desiree Andrews, midwife, and Karen Doherty, emergency physician. Claire loves science, and so do we. Come with us as we investigate the science and medicine from the worlds of Outlander.
Hello everyone, this is Karen, and I am bringing you this week's segment of Outlander Science Club, all about typhoid fever and the plague ship. So it is kind of hard to read these chapters and hear of the desperate state of affairs above the Porpoise. Captain Leonard describes that about 4 weeks ago, this type of plague started, and half the crew is sick, 30 men are dead, and he does not know what to do. And he describes an illness that starts with griping pains in the belly and a terrible flux or diarrhea and vomiting, as well as headache, fever, rash, and bleeding. And of course, Claire is not shrinking away in disgust. She finds herself quite intrigued, and she is ready to jump at the chance to identify this plague and help these men. And it doesn't take long before she's aboard the Porpoise and has identified this plague as typhoid fever. So let's talk about typhoid fever. It's not something we hear a lot about now in developed countries unless one is planning to travel to areas in the world where it's still endemic. But it's caused by the bacteria Salmonella, specifically Salmonella typhi. And that differs from the Salmonella you might hear about in regards to food poisoning, where you might get nausea and vomiting and diarrhea for a few days, maybe up to a week, and then recover. This is a totally different animal. Salmonella typhi causes significant symptoms, life-threatening illness that can last months. And just recently, scientists have figured out why, and it is because this strain of Salmonella has a toxin that is produced by the bacteria and kind of wreaks havoc throughout the body. So what happens is one takes in this bacteria orally. So it comes from contaminated water or food, and it is taken into the stomach where it actually survives the acidic environment of the stomach, enters the small intestine, and spreads from there. So symptoms begin anywhere from 5 to 21 days after exposure, and they follow a pretty characteristic pattern. So in the first week, the fever starts to rise, the bacteria spreads throughout the bloodstream, and patients may have malaise, headache, nosebleeds. The high fever continues in the second week, and abdominal pain begins. And patients, about a third, develop this characteristic rash on their abdomen. Just as Claire asked, do some of these men have a rash on their bellies? Many will develop this faint salmon-colored pattern of spots on their trunk and abdomen. So Claire notes men are having lots of diarrhea, lots of vomiting. And diarrhea actually isn't the rule. It is common in this illness, but patients can also be constipated. So that kind of confuses the picture a little bit. The third week of illness brings on a number of potential life-threatening complications. Patients can develop significant hemorrhage in the intestines. They can develop intestinal perforation or rupture in the small intestine. That's often fatal. They can become delirious, and they can develop inflammation and infection in other parts of the body, such as the brain, and develop encephalitis, pneumonia, or endocarditis in the heart. So the fourth week, if they survive these potential complications and don't have these happen to them, the fever begins to subside and symptoms resolve over the next week to months. A small subset, though, will go on to recover and no longer have symptoms, but still shed the bacteria in their stool and be able to transmit it to others, even though they're completely asymptomatic. So what is Claire to do? Well, she kind of approaches this with what looks like 3 main goals in mind. 1, sanitize the ship, clean this mess up so that we're not just spreading it because of the filth that they're living in. Number 2, avoid the spread of disease from the sick men to the healthy men. And 3, how to treat these men who are sick. So these sailors have been living in filth. They're too sick to even remove themselves to go use the facilities. So the floor is sticky, the stench is overpowering, so she undertakes to sanitize the area, boil and dry the hammocks, strip their clothes, wash the men. Then she quarantines them. The sick men need to be separated from the healthy men, including their sleeping quarters, their toilet facilities. Everything needs to be separate so that we can minimize the number of new cases. She also needs to make sure that the cook and the galley crew are practicing safe food handling, because that's likely where this all began. Now she has to figure out how she can help these men. So they're dehydrated, they've been vomiting, having diarrhea for the most part. She needs to figure out a way to hydrate them and provide nutrition. So she's hoping, but doubtful, that she could obtain milk, but the captain does tell her there are goats on board the Porpoise. So she plans to feed them boiled milk so that pathogens have been removed from the milk. Perhaps soaking biscuits in the milk to make them easy to eat. Of course, once the weevils have been knocked out. Yuck. And then once they recover, they need some kind of nutrition with a bit more calories, and they decide that fish soup will be good, and the purser even can come up with dried figs, sugar, and maybe even wine. She needs to support them while they get better. She doesn't have anything that she can use right now to kill this bacteria or to cure them, but she needs to support them so that they have the best possible chance of recovering from this. Would her penicillin have helped? Theoretically, yes, but she would have needed huge trunks of it to help all of these men. So that's not even an option, even if she still had some more of it left that she had with her on the Porpoise. So untreated typhoid carries a death rate of 10 to 30%. But when effectively treated with antibiotics now, that's dropped to just 1%. So typhoid fever is prevalent in impoverished areas around the world that have crowded environments and poor sanitation. And the incidence is highest in South Central Asia and Southern Africa. And transmission only happens from person to person. Their animals and insects do not carry this. It's simply from human to human. So in resource-rich settings in developed countries where we have good sanitation and practice good food handling, it's really rare. In the United States, there might be 200 or 300 cases per year. But worldwide, there are 22 million cases each year and about 200,000 deaths from typhoid fever. So now we know we can treat them with antibiotics. We are running into antibiotic resistance with this disease as well, which again is scary. There's also a vaccine available, and the vaccine in the US is recommended for people who will be traveling to these areas or people who have intimate exposure to someone who carries the disease, or for lab workers who might be working in a lab studying the disease and could be exposed. Of course, the vaccine doesn't have perfect protection. It's about 60 to 70% effective, depending on the form that's used. One interesting note from history is the story of Typhoid Mary, if you've heard of that. And she, it turns out, was a carrier of typhoid. And in the era before antibiotics or vaccines, about 4% of people who recovered from typhoid fever became asymptomatic carriers. So Mary's case is pretty famous. Mary Mallon was an Irish woman, and she worked in New York from 1900 to 1907, and she worked as a cook for 7 different families over that time. And during that time, each family she worked for came down with typhoid fever. 22 people over those years became ill, and 1 young girl died. So she finally caught the attention of a public health official, and she was taken into custody. And they discovered that she was an asymptomatic carrier, and they found significant amounts of bacteria, the Salmonella bacteria, in her gallbladder. And they kind of gave her 2 choices, either have her gallbladder removed or stop working as a cook. So she promised to stop working as a cook. She was released and started working, doing laundry for families. But this paid a lot less than working as a cook. So in 1915, she changed her name to Mary Brown and started working as a cook again. And she was actually hired at Sloan Hospital in New York City. And of course, not long after, an outbreak of typhoid fever happened. 25 people were infected and 2 died. So she was tracked down, she was arrested, and she was placed in quarantine in 1915. And she remained in quarantine until she died of pneumonia in 1938. So for all those years, from 1915 to 1938, she just lived solitary in quarantine. That was the public health remedy at that time. So fortunately, we have made great strides with antibiotic treatment and in public health. Of course, I'll admit that with antibiotic resistance becoming so prevalent, I do wonder where are we going with this? And are we going to find ourselves in a situation where things like this, again, aren't easily treated and carry these high death rates? Can you even imagine yourself on the Porpoise in Claire's situation? Claire describes it like this. The stench was overpowering. What air there was came down through crude ventilator shafts that reached the upper deck, but that was not a lot. Worse than unwashed semen was the reek of vomitus and the ripe, throat-clogging smell of blood-streaked diarrhea. So this is just, she describes a sucking noise as she walks into the area. Claire easily accepted this job. It's her nature. It's her calling. She has to do it. And probably my favorite quote from this chapter is, "I'm not a lady, Elias," I said tiredly. "I'm a doctor." So I love this because I happened to be looking into this when Katrina Balfe's campaign for the Unusual Lady t-shirt was out. And just how fitting is that? So I cannot wait to get mine. I hope you all have had an opportunity to get your shirt that shows that I'm an unusual lady. And in doing so, also support World Child Cancer, which is the organization Katrina Balfe is a patron for. And they work to provide resources and care for children worldwide suffering from cancer. So definitely something that we can all support. So please check in with us on our Twitter account at Outlander Sci and our Facebook page at Outlander Science Club. And until next time, when in doubt, ask yourself, what would Claire do? Bye-bye.